There is a dream that visits many of us, though we rarely speak of it. In this dream, you are wearing armor. Heavy, ornate, impenetrable. You have worn it so long that you cannot remember putting it on. You walk through a garden where everyone else moves freely, their skin touched by sunlight, their bodies light as air. But you carry the weight. The metal plates press against your chest with each breath. Your shoulders ache from bearing centuries of steel you never asked to carry. In the dream, you reach up to remove the helmet, to feel the wind on your face just once, but your fingers find no clasp, no hinge, no way to separate the armor from your skin. Because the armor is no longer something you wear. It has become something you are, and beneath it, you have forgotten what your true face looks like. This is not merely a dream. This is the hidden architecture of the modern psyche, the invisible cost of a story we have been telling ourselves since we could first stand upright and declare, "I am strong, I am unbreakable, I do not need." Tonight, we descend into one of consciousness's most seductive and dangerous illusions. We explore the tyranny of strength, not strength itself, which is a genuine human capacity, but the performance of strength, the religion of invulnerability, the mask we mistake for our face. We investigate what it costs us to be perpetually strong in a world that worships endurance and despises surrender. And we discover, perhaps, that the truest strength lies not in remaining unbroken, but in allowing ourselves to break open. This is the hidden cost of being strong, and it has already claimed more of you than you know. Let us begin with a question that seems simple but opens into an abyss. What if the very thing you believe protects you is the thing slowly destroying you? Consider the modern mythology of strength. Everywhere you look, you see its monuments. The entrepreneur who sleeps 4 hours and calls it discipline. The mother who never admits exhaustion and calls it devotion. The man who has not cried since childhood and calls it maturity. The woman who handles everything alone and calls it independence. The student who breaks under pressure but smiles and calls it resilience. We have built entire identities upon the foundation of appearing unshakable. We have made a religion out of not needing, not breaking, not asking, not surrendering. But beneath this performance, something is happening, something we refuse to see, because seeing it would require removing the armor, and we have convinced ourselves that without the armor, we would not survive. The ancient Greeks told a story about Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived. His mother, desperate to protect him, dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his body invulnerable to harm, except for one place, his heel, where she held him. That single point of vulnerability became his undoing. A poisoned arrow found that exact spot, and the immortal warrior fell. The story is often read as a tragedy about fate or the inevitability of death, but there is another reading, one that cuts deeper. Achilles' true tragedy was not that he had a weak spot. It was that he spent his entire life believing he was invulnerable everywhere else. He built his identity upon invincibility. He learned to move through the world as if he were immortal. And when reality finally pierced his illusion, he had no inner resources to meet it. He had never practiced being human. This is the hidden cost. Not that we might be wounded, but that we spend our lives pretending we cannot be wounded, and in doing so, we never develop the actual strength required to heal, to grow, to connect, to be fully alive. The performance of strength begins innocently enough. A child learns that tears bring punishment or dismissal. A teenager discovers that appearing confident is rewarded while vulnerability is exploited. An adult realizes that the world does not stop for pain, that showing weakness can mean losing status, income, relationships, respect. And so we adapt. We build the armor. We craft the mask. We learn to say, "I'm fine," when we are dissolving inside. But here is what no one tells us. The armor that protects us from the world eventually protects the world from us. The walls we build to keep pain out eventually keep love, connection, and authenticity trapped inside. We become unreachable, even to ourselves. We develop what psychologists call defensive exclusion, the systematic elimination of information that threatens our self-concept. We stop processing our own emotional reality because our identity is now based on not having one, and the cost accumulates silently. It shows up in the body as tension that never releases, as illness that cannot be explained, as exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. It shows up in relationships as distance that cannot be bridged, as arguments about nothing that are really about everything, as a loneliness that persists even when we are not alone. It shows up in the mind as anxiety without object, as depression without cause, as a vague sense that we are living someone else's life and watching from inside. This is the sleep of the mind, the state where we are so identified with our protective mechanisms that we can no longer distinguish between the armor and the self, between the performance and the truth, between who we have become and who we actually are. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The unconscious decision to be perpetually strong, to never need, never break, never surrender, directs more of our lives than we realize. It shapes what relationships we enter and how they fail. It determines what work we choose and how we burn out. It influences what emotions we allow and what parts of ourselves we exile into shadow. And all the while, we call it character. We call it maturity. We call it strength. But tonight, we remove the armor, not to be weak, but to discover what has been living beneath it all along. The authentic self that does not need to perform. The vulnerable heart that is capable of genuine connection. The fluid consciousness that can bend without breaking, because it knows that breaking open is different from breaking apart. We will trace the origins of this armor, how it forms in childhood, how culture reinforces it, how trauma seals it. We will descend into the darkness of what it costs, the relationships sacrificed, the life force diminished, the true self forgotten, and we will discover the awakening that lies on the other side, the integration that comes not from being unbreakable, but from being broken open and discovering that inside you are not emptiness or weakness, but an infinite capacity for transformation. This journey will ask something of you. It will ask you to consider that everything you have built to protect yourself might be the very thing preventing you from living. It will ask you to examine the difference between genuine strength and performed invulnerability. It will ask you to feel what you have been avoiding for years, perhaps decades, but it will also offer something. The possibility that on the other side of the armor lies not destruction, but liberation. That vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, but its highest expression. That the cost of being strong is nothing less than your actual life, and that life is asking you, right now, to put down the weight you never needed to carry. So we ask, are you ready to remove the armor? Are you ready to discover what has been living beneath it? Are you ready to explore the hidden cost of being strong, and to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, you have been strong in all the wrong ways? The journey into the mind's hidden architecture begins now, not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not with strength, but with the courage to be seen as you actually are. Let us descend together into the truth that strength tried to hide. The forging of the armor. To understand why we wear the armor, we must return to the forge where it was first created. We must go back to the moment consciousness learned that the world is not safe, that love is conditional, that vulnerability is dangerous. We must witness the birth of the defended self. Every child enters the world as pure vulnerability. The infant has no armor, no defenses, no capacity to pretend. It expresses need without shame, It cries when it hurts. It reaches for comfort without questioning whether it deserves to be held. This is the natural state of being, transparent, open, authentically responsive to its own experience. But then the world responds, and in that response, the architecture of strength begins to form. The British psychoanalyst John Bowlby spent decades studying how children develop attachments, and in that study, he discovered something profound. We do not learn who we are in isolation. We learn who we are through the mirror of another's response. The child reaches for comfort, and the parent's reaction becomes the child's first lesson about whether needs are acceptable, whether vulnerability is safe, whether the authentic self is worthy of love. When the parent responds with consistent attunement, seeing the child's distress and meeting it with comfort, the child develops what Bowlby called secure attachment. This child learns that vulnerability is not dangerous, that expressing need brings connection, that the authentic self is worthy of love. But this is not every child's story. Some children reach for comfort and find absence. The parent is physically present, but emotionally unavailable, trapped in their own unprocessed pain, depression, or dissociation. These children learn to be strong. They stop crying because crying brings no response. They stop reaching because reaching meets emptiness. They develop what psychologists call avoidant attachment, the systematic suppression of need, the performance of self-sufficiency, the armor of independence. They learn that vulnerability is pointless, so they bury it. They become the child who never causes problems, the teenager who doesn't need anyone, the adult who prides themselves on being self-reliant. Other children reach for comfort and find inconsistency. Sometimes the parent responds with love, sometimes with anger, sometimes with nothing at all. These children never know which version they will get. So they develop anxious attachment, a hypervigilance around others' emotions, a desperate need to be strong enough, good enough to finally receive consistent love. They become performers of strength, constantly monitoring whether they are being adequate, never able to rest because love feels perpetually conditional. And some children reach for comfort and find violation. The very people meant to protect them become sources of harm. These children develop disorganized attachment, a fragmented relationship to their own needs, where vulnerability is synonymous with danger. They build armor so thick that even they cannot find their way inside. They become strangers to themselves, experts at survival, warriors who can endure anything except tenderness. This is how the armor forms, not through choice, but through adaptation, not through weakness, but through the brilliant, heartbreaking intelligence of a nervous system learning to survive an environment that cannot meet its authentic needs. The neuroscientist Stephen Porges revolutionized our understanding of this process with his Polyvagal Theory. He discovered that the human nervous system has 3 states: social engagement, fight or flight, and shutdown. When we feel safe, we exist in social engagement. Our faces are animated, our voices have prosody, we are open to connection. But when we perceive danger, we shift into fight or flight. The body mobilizes, the mind narrows, and vulnerability feels life-threatening. And when danger feels inescapable, we collapse into shutdown, the freeze state where we are present but unreachable, alive but not living. What Porges revealed is that chronic stress, especially in childhood, trains the nervous system to default to defensive states. If vulnerability consistently brought pain, the system learns to avoid it. If emotional expression was met with punishment, the body learns to suppress it. The performance of strength is not a choice. It is a survival strategy encoded into the nervous system itself. But here is the tragedy. The armor that protected us in childhood becomes the prison that traps us in adulthood. The strategies that helped us survive a family system that could not hold our full humanity become the barriers that prevent us from building relationships that could. We carry child-sized armor into an adult world, and we wonder why we feel constricted, why intimacy feels terrifying, why we can never quite rest. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this paradox deeply. He wrote of how humans create values as armor against suffering. We tell ourselves stories about strength, willpower, and self-reliance, not because they are absolute truths, but because they give us a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. The performance of strength is what Nietzsche called a noble lie, a fiction that protects us from existential vulnerability but ultimately separates us from authentic being. Yet culture takes this individual armor and makes it collective. Society does not merely accept the defended self, it worships it. It builds entire economic systems on the fantasy of the autonomous individual who needs nothing from anyone. It creates mythologies of the self-made man, the independent woman, the person who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, as if connection, support, and vulnerability were signs of failure rather than the very conditions of human thriving. In Western culture particularly, we have inherited centuries of philosophical conditioning that valorizes strength and vilifies weakness. The Stoics taught emotional restraint as virtue. The Enlightenment celebrated rational autonomy over emotional interdependence. Capitalism commodified self-sufficiency and made dependence a moral failing. And modern technology promised that we could transcend the messy, vulnerable reality of human connection entirely, that we could be strong enough to not need, efficient enough to not feel, productive enough to not rest. This is the sleep of the mind in its fullest expression. We have so completely identified with the armor that we can no longer see it as armor. We believe the performance is the truth. We think the defended self is the real self. We mistake our survival strategies for our character, and the culture reinforces this delusion at every turn. Social media rewards the performance of effortless success. The workplace punishes any admission of struggle. The medical system treats symptoms but cannot address the existential exhaustion of a life spent performing strength. And popular psychology offers self-care and resilience training, which often translates to be strong enough to endure the unendurable without complaint. But beneath the armor, something is happening. The authentic self, the vulnerable, feeling, needing human being, is still there. Exiled perhaps, forgotten maybe, but alive. And it is trying to reach you through every symptom, every breakdown, every moment when the performance finally becomes unsustainable. Carl Jung called this exiled self the shadow, not evil but unlived, not dark but unseen. The shadow contains everything we rejected to become who we thought we needed to be. For those of us who armored ourselves in strength, the shadow contains our vulnerability, our need, our tears, our exhaustion, our fear, our tenderness, our longing to be held. It contains everything human that we exile to maintain the performance, and the shadow does not remain passive. It erupts, it sabotages, it creates the very crises that force us to confront what we have been avoiding, the burnout that cannot be pushed through, the relationship that ends because we could never be reached, the illness that forces us to finally need help, the breakdown that becomes breakthrough because, for the first time, the armor cracks and we glimpse what has been living inside all along. This is the forge where the armor was created, in childhood's betrayals, in culture's demands, in the nervous system's brilliant adaptation to an unsafe world. But the forge is also where the armor can be unmade, not through more strength, but through the courage to finally feel what we have been defending against. Not through more control, but through surrender to what has always been true, that we are vulnerable beings in a fragile world, and that this vulnerability is not a flaw to overcome, but the very ground of our humanity. The ancient alchemists understood transformation as a process of solvet coagula, dissolve and coagulate. First, the old form must be dissolved. The armor must be melted down. The defended self must be seen for what it is, a strategy, not an identity. And only then can something new coagulate, a self that is whole rather than defended, integrated rather than fragmented, strong not because it cannot break, but because it knows how to heal. But this dissolution requires descending further into the cost. We must see what the armor has taken from us. We must feel what it cost to be strong. We must witness the hidden price of the protected life. And so we continue our descent. From the forge where the armor was made to the wasteland where we discover what we lost while wearing it. The cost. Living behind the wall. There is a cost to wearing armor every day of your life. Not the obvious cost, the weight, the discomfort, the restriction of movement, but the invisible cost. The cost that accumulates so slowly you do not notice it, until one day you wake up and realize you have been living your entire life behind glass. You can see out, but you cannot be touched. You can observe love, but you cannot feel it land. You can go through all the motions of being human while remaining fundamentally unreached. This is the hidden price. Not that we suffer dramatically, but that we stop feeling anything fully. Not that we are obviously broken, but that we are secretly hollow. Not that we fail, but that we succeed at building a life that looks functional from the outside, while being profoundly disconnected from meaning, purpose, and authentic connection on the inside. Let us name the costs one by one, slowly, the way you would count coins retrieved from a well where you threw wishes as a child, only to discover later that each coin was a piece of your life you would never get back. The first cost, the death of intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability, not the performed vulnerability of confessing your trauma on the first date or sharing your diagnoses like trading cards, but true vulnerability, the capacity to be seen as you actually are in the moment without editing, without performance, without armor. The defended self cannot do this. The person who must always be strong cannot admit when they feel weak. The person who must always be competent cannot reveal their confusion. The person who must always be independent cannot express their need. And so relationships become elaborate dances of partial truth where we are together, but fundamentally alone. The psychologist Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy, discovered something remarkable in her decades of studying couples. The problem in most struggling relationships is not conflict. It is emotional disconnection. And that disconnection happens when one or both partners are too defended to be reached. She found that behind every fight about dishes or money or in-laws, there is a deeper conversation happening, a cry for connection that cannot be expressed directly because expressing need feels too dangerous. So instead, we fight, we withdraw, we criticize, we create distance while desperately longing for closeness, because the armor that once protected us from childhood wounds now prevents us from receiving adult love. Consider the man who was raised to believe that real men don't cry, don't need, don't feel. He enters relationships with the armor fully intact. His partner reaches for emotional connection and he offers solutions. She shares her pain and he fixes the problem without feeling it. She asks, "Are you okay?" And he says, "I'm fine," even when he is drowning. Over time, she stops reaching. Not because she stops loving him, but because reaching for someone who is defended is like reaching for a person through glass. You can see them, but you cannot touch them. And eventually, the loneliness of being with someone you cannot reach becomes more painful than being alone. Or consider the woman who learned that her needs were burdens, that her emotions were too much, that love was something she had to earn through being strong enough, capable enough, independent enough. She enters relationships with the secret conviction that she must not need anything. So she gives, supports, nurtures, but never asks. She is the partner everyone wants because she is so low maintenance. But beneath the performance, She is starving, and one day she realizes she has built a relationship where she is needed but not known, where she is valued for what she provides but not loved for who she is. And the resentment that accumulates becomes the ending she never wanted, but secretly engineered by never showing her authentic self. This is the first cost. We lose intimacy, not because we choose bad partners, but because we are too defended to allow good partners to reach us. We build relationships on the foundation of who we pretend to be, and then we wonder why we feel alone even when we are not. The second cost, the exile of the body. The armor is not merely psychological, it is somatic, encoded into muscle, breath, posture, and sensation. The defended person learns to live from the neck up. The body becomes an object to be controlled rather than a source of wisdom to be felt. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent his career proving that consciousness is not separate from the body, but emerges from it. Emotion is not something that happens in the mind and then affects the body. Emotion is the body's way of knowing and responding to the world. Before you consciously recognize fear, your body has already responded. Before you know you are attracted to someone, your nervous system has already moved toward connection, but the defended person cannot afford to feel the body's knowledge, because the body tells the truth. It says, "I am tired," when the armor insists you are strong. It says, "I am afraid," when the performance demands confidence. It says, "I need rest," when the culture celebrates hustle, and so we learn to override it. We drink coffee to suppress exhaustion. We take pills to silence anxiety. We interpret pain as weakness rather than information. We become brilliant at ignoring the body's signals until the body stops sending signals altogether. This is what trauma therapists call dissociation, the split between mind and body, between conscious awareness and somatic truth. And it is not only trauma survivors who experience this. Anyone who has learned to be perpetually strong develops a mild functional dissociation. We are present but not embodied. We are alive but not feeling. We move through the world like ghosts, piloting meat suits, executing tasks but never quite landing in the direct experience of being. The cost accumulates in the body as chronic tension that never releases, the shoulders that hold decades of responsibility, the jaw that clamps around unspoken rage, the chest that has forgotten how to fully breathe because deep breathing brings feeling, and feeling threatens the armor, the gut that carries unexpressed emotion and manifests as digestive disorders that medicine cannot explain, the immune system that attacks the self because the mind has been at war with the body for so long that the body no longer knows what is self and what is threat. Bessel van der Kolk, in his groundbreaking work The Body Keeps the Score, demonstrated that unprocessed emotional experience does not disappear. It goes underground. It manifests as chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, addiction, and a pervasive sense of being uncomfortable in your own skin. The cost of being strong is paid in the body's slow betrayal, the health that fails for no clear reason, the energy that never returns, the vitality that leaks away year after year until you can barely remember what it felt like to feel good in your own flesh. The third cost, the narrowing of life. When you must always be strong, you cannot afford to take risks, because risk means the possibility of failure, and failure would crack the armor, and beneath the armor is everything you have spent your life avoiding. So life narrows. You stick with what you know. You choose careers that are safe rather than meaningful. You avoid relationships that might challenge you to grow. You say no to opportunities that excite you but terrify you, because terror means vulnerability, and vulnerability is forbidden. The existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called shut-upness, the state of being so defended against life's inherent uncertainty that we close ourselves off from possibility itself. We become, in his words, spiritually sick not because we lack faith, but because we refuse to risk becoming who we actually are. We choose the known misery of the defended life over the unknown possibility of authentic being. This narrowing shows up everywhere. The creative project you never start because it might fail. The conversation you never have because it might get emotional. The love you never pursue because you might be rejected. The career change you never make because it would mean admitting the last 20 years were spent climbing the wrong mountain. The therapy you never try because it might require you to feel what you have been defending against. And so you build a life that is safe but small, controlled but meaningless, strong but hollow. You achieve all the external markers of success while experiencing none of the internal sense of being fully alive. You become what Jung called the provisional person, someone who is always preparing to live, always strengthening the defenses, but never actually risking the vulnerability required for a life of depth, meaning, and authentic connection. The fourth cost, the tyranny of control. When you are defended, you cannot trust life. You cannot trust others. You cannot even trust yourself. Because trust requires surrender, and surrender feels like death. So you try to control everything. You micromanage your environment. You anticipate every possible problem. You plan for every contingency. You develop elaborate systems to ensure you will never be caught off guard, never be vulnerable, never need anyone. But control is exhausting. It is a full-time job that never ends. And the harder you try to control life, the more life escapes your grasp. The more you try to control your emotions, the more they erupt in unexpected ways. The more you try to control your relationships, the more people pull away. The more you try to control your body, the more it rebels. This is the paradox of the defended life. The strategies we use to feel safe make us increasingly unsafe. The control we seek creates chaos. The strength we perform becomes the source of our weakness. The philosopher Alan Watts spoke of this as the backwards law, the idea that the more you try to control life, the more out of control you feel. Because life is inherently uncontrollable. People leave, bodies age, plans fail, markets crash, loved ones die, and no amount of strength, no perfection of the armor can change these fundamental truths. The defended person learns this too late, often in the moment when the thing they most feared finally happens. The marriage ends, the body breaks, the child rebels, the career implodes, and in that moment they discover that all the years spent building the armor were years stolen from actually learning how to meet life's inevitable difficulties with resilience, flexibility, and genuine strength, the kind that comes not from never breaking, but from knowing how to heal. The fifth cost, the loss of the self. But perhaps the deepest cost is this: when you spend your entire life performing strength, you forget who you are beneath the performance. The armor becomes your identity. The defended self becomes the only self you know. This is what psychologists call false self-disorder, the condition where you are so adapted to external demands, so skilled at performing who you think you should be, that you lose contact with who you actually are. You become a collection of roles, functions, and performances with no center. A resume with no person inside, a reputation with no authentic being beneath it. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott distinguished between the true self and the false self. The true self is spontaneous, creative, vulnerable, authentic. It is who you are when no one is watching, when there is nothing to prove, when you can just be. The false self is the adapted self, the one who learned to be what others needed, to suppress what was unacceptable, to perform who you thought you had to be to survive. For the defended person, the false self is the strong self, and it is so well developed, so functional, so praised by the world, that it becomes indistinguishable from identity itself. You believe you are the person who handles everything, who needs nothing, who never breaks. And the true self, the vulnerable, feeling, needing human being, becomes a ghost haunting the edges of your consciousness, trying to reach you through dreams, symptoms, and the vague sense that you are living someone else's life. The tragedy is that by the time you realize this, decades have passed. You have built a career around being strong. You have attracted relationships with people who value your strength. You have developed a reputation as the person who has it all together, and now the thought of removing the armor feels like death. Because if you are not the strong one, who are you? If you are not the person who handles everything, what is your value? If you allow yourself to need, to hurt, to be imperfect, will anyone still love you? These questions are terrifying, so most people never ask them. They keep wearing the armor until their bodies force them to stop, until the heart attack in their 50s, until the divorce in their 60s, until the depression in their 70s, when they finally retire and discover they have no idea who they are when they are not performing a function. This is the hidden cost of being strong. You lose the only life you will ever have. You spend it building and maintaining the armor, and you never discover what was inside all along, the authentic self that did not need armor because it was never really as fragile as you feared. The collective cost. But the cost is not only individual, it is collective. When an entire culture worships strength and vilifies vulnerability, we create a world of defended people who cannot connect, cannot trust, cannot ask for help, and cannot offer authentic support. We see this in the suicide rates among men who cannot admit they are struggling, in the burnout epidemic among women who are trying to have it all and be it all while admitting nothing, in the loneliness epidemic where people are more connected technologically than ever but more isolated emotionally than at any point in human history, in the political polarization where we cannot hear each other because we are too defended to feel each other's pain, in the environmental crisis where we cannot respond with collective action because we are too individuated to remember that we are fundamentally interdependent. The defended culture creates defended institutions, workplaces that demand constant productivity, schools that measure only performance, healthcare systems that treat symptoms without addressing the soul's sickness, governments that promise security while delivering surveillance, and economic systems that commodify everything, including human vulnerability itself. And we call this normal. We call this adulthood. We call this strength. When really, it is the sleep of the mind at its most profound, the collective delusion that we can live fully human lives while being fundamentally defended against our own humanity. But the cost is now becoming impossible to ignore. The bodies are breaking. The relationships are failing. The planet is dying. And more people are waking up to the realization that the armor is not protecting them. It is suffocating them. And in that suffocation, paradoxically, there is hope. Because the crisis that forces us to face what we have been avoiding is also the invitation to finally live differently. The breakdown of the defended self is the beginning of the awakening to the authentic self, and so we arrive at the moment of choice. Will we keep wearing the armor, paying the cost until there is nothing left of us but the metal shell? Or will we find the courage to remove it, to feel what we have been avoiding, to discover what has been waiting beneath it all along? The awakening begins not with strength, but with surrender, not with more control, but with the willingness to be out of control, not with having it together, but with falling apart and discovering that on the other side of that falling is not the annihilation we feared, but the integration we have been seeking our entire lives. Let us continue the descent, from the cost into the awakening, from the armor into the truth, from the performance into the possibility of living as we actually are. The awakening, breaking open, not apart. There is a Japanese art form called kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with lacquer mixed with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, the artist highlights them. The breaks become part of the beauty. The object is not restored to its original state, but transformed into something more valuable, a piece that carries its history of breakage as a kind of luminous truth. This is the metaphor we need now, not restoration to who we were before we armored, not a return to childhood innocence, but transformation through the integration of our breakage. The awakening is not about becoming unbroken. It is about breaking open and discovering that inside the crack is not emptiness, but gold. The journey from defended to authentic begins with a crisis. It must, because we do not voluntarily remove armor that we believe is keeping us alive. We must be forced, through illness, through loss, through a moment of such profound disconnection that continuing the performance becomes more painful than facing what lies beneath it. For some, it is the body that rebels, the heart that stops in the middle of a meeting, the immune system that turns against itself, the chronic pain that no doctor can explain, the exhaustion so profound that you cannot get out of bed, even though there is nothing wrong with you. The body, in its wisdom, creates the crisis that the mind has been avoiding. It forces the armor off through sheer physical incapacity. For others, it is relationship. The partner who finally says, "I cannot reach you." The child who stops talking to you because you were never truly present. The friend who gently suggests that you seem like you are going through the motions. The loneliness that becomes so unbearable that you finally admit you have been alone all along, even in rooms full of people. For still others, it is existential. The achievement of the goal, the promotion, the house, the marriage, the status, only to discover it brings no fulfillment. The sudden awareness, usually in middle age, that you have been living someone else's life. The panic attack that arrives without warning and whispers the truth. This life you have built is not sustainable. The person you pretend to be is killing the person you actually are. Whatever form it takes, the crisis is the invitation, not to collapse into permanent weakness, but to finally face what strength has been defending against. The first awakening, the discovery of grief. The defended person carries decades of unlived grief, not only for losses that happened, but for the life that did not happen because they were too armored to live it, for the love they could not receive, for the self they could not be, for the years spent performing instead of living. The awakening begins when this grief is finally felt, not thought about, not analyzed, not explained, but felt in the body. And this requires what trauma therapists call titration, the slow, careful process of allowing feeling without being overwhelmed by it. You do not have to cry all the tears at once. You do not have to feel all the pain in a single moment. But you must begin. You must allow the first crack in the armor, the first tear that escapes the control, the first admission that you are not fine and have not been fine for a very long time. And here is what happens in that crack. You discover you do not dissolve. The thing you feared, that feeling would destroy you, does not happen. You cry, and you survive the crying. You admit you are struggling, and the world does not end. You show vulnerability, and you are not rejected. Or if you are, you discover you can survive that too. This is the beginning of what Jung called the integration of the shadow. All the feelings you exile to maintain the armor, the sadness, the fear, the need, the tenderness, begin to return. And as they return, you become more whole, not weaker but more complete, not less functional but more alive. The second awakening, the return to the body. The defended person lives in the head. The awakening requires a return to the body, not the body as object to be controlled, but the body as a source of wisdom, as the site where feeling lives, as the ground of authentic being. This return happens through practice, through learning to breathe again fully, the way you did as a child, through movement that is not exercise for appearance, but embodied experience for its own sake, dance, yoga, walking in nature, through touch that is not sexual but affirming, massage, hugging, the simple experience of being held. The body, when we return to it, tells us things the mind has been hiding. It reveals where we hold tension, where we store trauma, where we are still armored. And it also reveals capacity, the places where pleasure lives, where energy flows, where we can feel connected to something larger than our individual consciousness. Somatic therapists have discovered that trauma is not only a psychological wound, but a physiological one. The nervous system gets stuck in defensive states, and the body keeps playing out the protective patterns long after the danger has passed. But the body can also heal. Through careful, compassionate attention to sensation, through learning to distinguish between past danger and present safety, the nervous system can return to social engagement. The armor can soften. The defended self can gradually learn to lower the shield. This is not a quick process. The armor was built over years, sometimes decades. It cannot be removed overnight, but it can be gradually, carefully, tenderly dismantled. Not through force, but through compassion, not through more control, but through learning to be with what is. The third awakening, the practice of vulnerability. The defended person believes vulnerability is weakness. The awakening reveals that vulnerability is strength, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. And truth is the ground of authentic connection, meaningful work, and a life of integrity. But vulnerability is not the same as oversharing or the performance of woundedness that has become popular in some circles. True vulnerability is not telling your trauma story to strangers. It is the capacity to be present with your actual experience, to allow yourself to be seen as you are, to show up authentically even when you do not have it all figured out. The researcher Brené Brown has spent 2 decades studying vulnerability, and her findings are revolutionary. People who live with a strong sense of love and belonging believe they are worthy of love and belonging. That is the difference. Not that they are more loved, but that they believe they are worthy of it. And that belief does not come from being perfect or strong or having it together. It comes from the willingness to be seen in their imperfection, their struggles, their authentic humanity. The practice of vulnerability begins small, with admitting to one safe person that you are not okay, with asking for help with something you could technically do yourself, with saying "I don't know" in a meeting, with crying in front of your partner instead of waiting until you are alone, with sharing your fear instead of your certainty, with expressing need instead of independence. And what you discover, gradually, is that the people who are worth keeping in your life respond to vulnerability with compassion. They move closer, not farther away. They appreciate your humanity. They feel permission to be more human themselves. And the people who reject your vulnerability, they reveal themselves as people who need you to be armored because they are too defended to meet you in your authentic humanity. And losing those relationships, while painful, is actually a gift, the clearing away of connections that were based on performance rather than truth. The fourth awakening, the wisdom of interdependence. The defended person believes they must be self-sufficient. The awakening reveals that interdependence is not a failure, but the fundamental condition of human existence. We are born utterly dependent. We die often requiring care. And in between, we are constantly relying on others. For food we did not grow, for shelter we did not build, for knowledge we did not discover, for emotional support we cannot provide for ourselves. The fantasy of complete independence is just that, a fantasy. And it is a culturally specific fantasy, particularly strong in Western individualistic societies, but not universal across human cultures. The awakening to interdependence is the recognition that needing others is not a weakness but a biological reality, that asking for help is not a failure but an act of honesty, that we heal not in isolation but in connection, that strength is not about being invulnerable but about being able to receive support when we are vulnerable. This requires a fundamental shift in identity, from "I'm the strong one who helps others" to "I'm a human being who both gives and receives care," from "I do not need anyone" to "I need people, and that is okay," from "asking for help is shameful" to "asking for help is an act of trust that deepens relationship." And in this shift, something miraculous happens. Relationships become more real. When you allow yourself to need, you give others the gift of being needed. When you show your struggles, you create space for others to share theirs. When you stop performing in vulnerability, you invite authentic connection. And in that connection, you discover that you are not alone in your humanity, that everyone is struggling with something, that no one has it all together, that the performance of strength was isolating you from the very support that could help you genuinely thrive. The fifth awakening, the integration of strength and vulnerability. The awakening is not about replacing strength with weakness. It is about discovering a different kind of strength, the kind that comes not from never breaking, but from breaking open and integrating the fragments. This is what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the paradoxical discovery that the very experiences that broke us also gave us depth, compassion, wisdom, and a capacity to meet life with greater flexibility and authenticity. Not that trauma is good, but that when we face it, feel it, and integrate it, we become more human, more whole, more capable of genuine connection and meaningful action in the world. The integrated person is not unarmored. They have boundaries, self-protection, the capacity to say no. But their armor is not their identity. It is a tool they can put on and take off as needed. They can be strong when the situation requires it, but they can also be vulnerable, playful, tender, uncertain. They have access to the full range of human experience because they are no longer defending against half of it. This integration is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. It is the journey from the defended false self to the authentic true self, and it is, in Jung's view, the central task of the second half of life. Not to achieve more, but to integrate what was split, not to become successful, but to become whole. The sixth awakening, the recognition of the sacred. And finally, in the deepest awakening, there is the recognition that beneath the armor was never just the vulnerable self. There was also something infinite, something that cannot be wounded, something that mystics and sages have pointed to for millennia, but that the defended person cannot access because they are too busy protecting the small self to discover the vast self. This is not religious dogma, but direct experience. When the armor comes off, when the defended self loosens its grip, there is sometimes a moment of pure being, a recognition that you are not merely this body, this history, this collection of wounds and defenses. You are also consciousness itself, awareness itself, the space in which all experience arises. This recognition does not make the human struggles disappear. You still have a body that hurts, relationships that challenge you, work that stresses you. But there is a shift in identification. You are not only the person these things happen to, you are also the awareness that witnesses them. And that awareness is vast, spacious, unbroken. The mystics of every tradition describe this. The Hindu concept of Atman, the true self that is identical with Brahman, the infinite. The Buddhist recognition of no self, where the defended ego is seen through as an illusion. The Christian mystic's experience of union with the divine, the Sufi dissolution of the self into love, all pointing to the same truth, that beneath the armor, beneath even the authentic self, there is something that was never wounded and never needed protection. This is not an escape from human vulnerability. It is the ground that allows us to meet vulnerability without being destroyed by it. When you know yourself as both the wave and the ocean, you can allow the wave to crash without fearing annihilation. When you recognize that your deepest identity is not the defended self, but the consciousness that witnesses all selves, you can allow the armor to fall away, because you know that what you truly are cannot be harmed. The lived awakening. But awakening is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily choice to live from authenticity rather than armor, from truth rather than performance, from connection rather than defense. Some days you will forget. The armor will go back on without your noticing. You will find yourself performing strength, defending against feeling, pretending to be fine when you are not, and that is okay. The awakening is not about never defending. It is about noticing when you are defending and choosing in that moment to soften, to breathe, to feel, to be real. And gradually, over time, the awakening becomes not a peak experience, but a way of being. You learn to live with less armor and more authenticity. You build relationships based on truth rather than performance. You make choices aligned with your actual values rather than external expectations. You discover work that is meaningful rather than merely functional. You develop a relationship with your body based on listening rather than controlling. You allow yourself to be a human being rather than a human doing. This is the transformation from defended to authentic, from armored to alive. From performing strength to embodying the genuine strength that comes from vulnerability, integration, and the courage to be seen as you actually are. The invitation to remove the armor. We have traveled a long way together, from the forge where the armor was created, through the wasteland where we counted its costs, to the awakening that reveals what lives beneath it. And now we arrive at the question that matters most. What will you do with this knowledge? Because knowledge alone changes nothing. You can understand everything in this exploration intellectually and still live your entire life behind the armor. The mind is brilliant at taking insights and turning them into new defenses. You can become strong at understanding your defenses without ever actually lowering them. The invitation is not to understand, but to risk. To take one small action that cracks the armor, to speak one vulnerable truth, to ask for one thing you need, to feel one feeling you have been avoiding, to show up as you actually are in one conversation where you would normally perform. This is terrifying. It should be. You are being asked to do the thing you have spent your life learning is dangerous. You are being asked to trust that on the other side of the armor is not the annihilation you fear, but the life you have been seeking. But here is what we have learned. The armor is not protecting you anymore. It is preventing you from living. The cost of being strong is your actual life, your relationships, your health, your creativity, your joy, your authentic connection to yourself and others. And that cost is too high. The awakening asks you to consider, what if vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, but its highest expression? What if breaking open is different from breaking apart? What if the thing you have been most afraid of, being seen as you actually are, is the very thing that will set you free? These are not rhetorical questions. They require lived answers. They require you to experiment with living differently, to slowly, carefully, compassionately remove the armor and discover what has been waiting beneath it all along. And you do not have to do this alone. In fact, you cannot do it alone. The awakening happens in relationship, with a therapist who can hold space for your unarmoring, with friends who can meet you in vulnerability, with partners who can love you without needing you to be strong, with communities that value authenticity over performance. The world is changing. More people are waking up to the hidden costs of the defended life. More conversations are happening about mental health, emotional authenticity, the importance of vulnerability. The culture is slowly shifting from worshipping strength to valuing wholeness. You are not alone in this awakening. You are part of a collective evolution in human consciousness, from defended to authentic, from armored to alive. But it begins with you, with your willingness to see the armor for what it is, to feel the cost of wearing it, to imagine what life might be like without it. And then, when you are ready, to take the first small risk of removing it. The poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you. The armor protects you from being wounded, yes, but it also prevents the light from entering. It keeps you safe but small, defended but dead." The awakening is the recognition that you cannot live a full life while remaining invulnerable, that the wound is not the problem. The armor that prevents the wound from healing is the problem. So we ask you now, what would your life look like if you were not performing strength? What relationships might be possible if you allowed yourself to be seen? What work might you pursue if you were not defending against failure? What joy might you experience if you allowed yourself to feel without control? Who might you become if you finally removed the armor you have been wearing since childhood? These questions do not have immediate answers. They are invitations to a journey. The journey from defended to authentic, from armored to alive, from sleeping to awake. And the journey begins now, not tomorrow, not when you are ready, not when you are stronger, now. With whatever small act of vulnerability you can manage in this moment, with one breath that goes all the way down, with one feeling that you allow instead of suppressing, with one truth that you speak instead of hiding. The hidden cost of being strong is everything that matters. But the gift of vulnerability is life itself, real, messy, painful, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly worth living. The armor served you well. It protected you when you needed protection, but you do not need it anymore. You are no longer the child who had to defend against an unsafe world. You are an adult with choice, agency, and the capacity to create relationships and environments where your authentic self can be safe. So we end with this. The armor is waiting to be removed. The authentic self is waiting to be lived. The life you have been seeking is waiting on the other side of the performance. Will you take the risk? Will you crack the armor? Will you discover what has been living inside all along? The answer matters, not only for you, but for everyone whose life you touch. Because when you remove the armor, you give others permission to remove theirs. When you show up authentically, you create space for authentic connection. When you stop performing strength, you reveal that genuine strength comes not from being invulnerable, but from being courageously, beautifully, imperfectly human. This is the hidden cost of being strong and the infinite gift of being real. The sleep of the mind ends when you wake up to the armor you have been wearing, and the awakening begins when you find the courage to take it off. Welcome to your life. Welcome to your authentic self. Welcome to the journey of becoming who you have always been beneath the armor. The invitation is offered, the choice is yours, and whatever you choose, may you choose it consciously. May you live it fully. May you discover that the greatest strength is not in never breaking, but in breaking open and finding that inside you are not emptiness or weakness, but an infinite capacity for transformation, connection, and the courage to be profoundly, vulnerably, authentically alive.